All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session, Shifting Gears on Mode Shift, Understanding the Impacts of Micromobility on Overall Travel Behavior. I am your room host for today, Ariana Smith from NABSA. And as you're all joining, I'd just like to make a few quick announcements. This is going to be the last session for today. We'll kick off tomorrow with the NABSA annual meeting, and we encourage everyone to attend. Our public forum is open and a great place to discuss your conference session takeaways. So hop on over there to chat with each other and let each other know what you're learning. Don't forget to visit the expo. You can earn points towards a game, and you can visit the game tab to see other ways to earn points. And if you're gonna share what you're learning on Twitter, please use the hashtag NABSA2020 to keep us in the loop. We will be getting started in just a moment. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Andrew, our moderator for today.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. My name is Andy Zaleski, and I'm today's moderator for the session titled Shifting Gears on Mode Shift, Understanding the Impact of Micromobility on Travel Behavior. Before we start, just a little bit about myself. I'm a project manager and transportation planner at Foursquare ITP with nearly a decade of experience working in the micromobility field. I lead Foursquare's micromobility practice, and I help clients with feasibility studies, business plans, expansion plans, and procurement around bike share and micromobility programs. So today, we're really here to hear from our fantastic speakers. I'm really excited to have these four people present. They bring different perspectives to the topic of mode shift. So we'll be touching on everything from how external shocks, so things like COVID, an oil shock in Mexico, how they impact ridership on micromobility service, to how new technologies and the availability of things like scooters impact ridership on micromobility. So we're really going to be covering a wide range of topics. We want this to be an interactive session. So after our presentations, we're going to have a Q&A. We also have a few poll questions. And to get started, we wanted to learn a little bit more about you guys, everyone who's in on the call. So if you navigate to the poll, which is in the main window on Pathable for the meeting, you'll see a bunch of poll questions. If you could vote on the first one, which is which of the following best describes your organization, it'll just give us a little bit of a better idea about who's in attendance today. So I'll just give you all a second to do that, and we'll see what the results are. So I'm seeing votes come in, and we have a pretty diverse audience represented. About a third of you all are private sector micromobility operators. Oh, that went down to a quarter. I'll give it a second as people come in. But yeah, I see a good mix between nonprofit, public sector, and private sector operators, as well as folks who don't directly operate or oversee micromobility services, either on the public side or private side. And then also a small share, 6%, are on the advocacy, and no one said none of the above, so I'm glad our options covered covered the universe. So our first presenter today is Alberto Ibarra Garza. Alberto is currently a decision analyst professor at IPADA Business School in Mexico City. He holds a PhD in management from IESE Business School, an MBA from IPADA, and a public accounting degree from the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. Before academia, Alberto worked as a financial auditor for KPMG and as a strategy and operations consultant for Deloitte Consulting Group. Alberto has been researching urban mobility for the past 2 years, in particular bike share systems. In this endeavor, he's collaborated with BKT Bici Publica, Mi Bici's operator in Guadalajara, Mexico, as a strategy consultant. So with that, I will hand it over to Alberto.
Thank you very much, Andy. Nice to see you all over here. So I'm going to present an interesting study of analysis that we did on how the oil shortage that we had in Mexico in 2019 impacted the use of bike sharing systems, right? So this is co-authored with Xavier Barriola from IESE Business School and Gabriel Pensamiento from CATS Graduate School of Business. So next slide, please. Now, I'll be explaining each one. So in 2018, we had a change of president in Mexico. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, referred to as AMLO, was elected president. And one of his first activities that we will see in the next slide, major changes that he did in the government, was to tackle, please, next slide, please, was to tackle gasoline theft. So how does that take place? Well, pretty much people find these ways to connect to those main pipes that transport gasoline within the country, and then they sell it in informal markets. So this had a huge impact on the economy of the oil, the state-operated oil and gas company. So Andrés Manuel López Obrador said, we have to tackle this somehow. Next slide, please. So one of the first activities he did was then he decided to close the main pipelines that transport the gasoline within the country. So what's the problem with this? That once you want to transport gasoline through trucks, obviously it's going to be much less efficient. And we had some important oil shortages and gasoline shortages around the country. We could see this in our next slide. This is a picture of a gasoline stop in station in Guadalajara. The next slide, please. And we will see how all these huge lines were forming up in different places around the country. So suddenly it would take people 2, 3, 4 hours to get access to gasoline. So this gave us, next slide, please, an interesting but situation that we would call in academia a natural experiment, where we could see how this external shock, this exogenous shock of an operator of a public bike sharing system, how did this impact the use of non-motorized transportation? In this case, specifically bike sharing systems. Next slide, please. And in Mexico, we have 2 systems, Mi Bici in Guadalajara, operated by BKT Bici Pública, and Ecobici, operated by Clear Channel. So these are the 2 big bike sharing systems that we have in Mexico. Next slide, please. And we analyzed specifically Mi Bici's operation in Guadalajara, where we would have had this conference if we didn't have the pandemia, but we'll have them next year. We'll have the opportunity to receive you all in Guadalajara. I live in Mexico City, by the way. And why did we analyze Mi Bici? Well, there's something very specific. They follow the Open Data Initiative of sharing all the statistics of the rides and all the bike trips. However, they have a unique information that's the user ID. Almost all operating open data systems don't provide a user ID. So now we could have an interesting analysis of how did the oil shortage impact at an individual level. So it's a false ID, it's still anonymous, but in the end, it's still something that could allow us to track individual usage. So they've had in their first 6 years of operation around 14 million bike trips. They have close to 3,000 bikes. That's a little bit less than half than the 6,500 that you have in Mi Bici in Mexico City. 274 stations, and they've had close to 90,000 registered users. Next slide, please. So let's see some of those impacts. First, without any econometrics, just the idea of visual. Data visuals, right? So let's see these charts that we could allow us to understand a little bit better what happened. So here we have the oil shortage lasted around 2 weeks, around the first 2 weeks of January, like from the 6th to the 20th, a little bit more. So we could see that in the vertical dotted lines, okay? So as after the break of Christmas break, we could see an important increase in usage, both in ridership, that's the blue line, and in users of the system, that's in the dotted red line, right? So that increased substantially between these 2 dates. However, after the oil shortage ended, we still continued with an important level of usage of these bikes. So we could continue going with the next slide, please. How else can we see the impact that this oil shortage had on the usage of Mi Bici? Well, here we have access to the different routes that people took, right? So there was an increase around 20% of unique routes that people took during this oil shortage. We could see that the peak before the shortage was around 8,000, and we reached the peak a little bit above 10,000 of unique routes, okay? So people taking routes that they didn't take before the shortage, and that we have a downward trend after it was resolved, but still higher than previous levels. Can we go please to the next slide? Obviously, if people are taking different routes, then obviously they're also taking probably longer distances, right? So they're taking it in ways that they probably didn't take this before. We also see the drop after this is resolved, but still in the months after the shortage, we still got this this important impact. Next slide, please. This is probably one of the most important graphs that we showed during this during my section of the presentation. This is registered new users. Because we have this anonymized access to specific IDs or specific users, now we could see when do people have their first usage of the system. So during the 2 weeks of the shortage, we have an important spike in new users that can't be explained by any type of marketing campaign, price discount, or anything else. Okay, so this has been tested in many ways. So it's pretty much because of this shortage. So what does this tell us in terms of micromobility? That people did look towards bike sharing systems as a substitute to whatever they used before. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, this is part of an academic paper, so you're gonna have to see these ugly tables with little stars telling us a little bit of statistical significance. But let me just try to summarize this. We have during. What does during mean? On the left side, during means during the shortage. During the shortage, rides increase. We see this 0.444. We have a logarithmic transformation. So in order to turn this to a percentage, we have to take the exponential out. Don't worry, guys, you don't have to do that. I already kind of have the numbers. What does this tell us? During the pandemic, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about the pandemic now. During the shortage, we had around 56% more rides, around 3% more duration of the trips, and around 5% longer distances of the travels. However, post, what does this mean? After the shortage was resolved and comparing it towards pre-shortage levels, we could see that still the ridership increased 43%. So that maintained, and we saw that in the previous graph. And well, pretty much, I mean, the important thing is during the shortage, 56% more rides. After the shortage, it's still 43% more. So we have a significant impact. If we go to the next slide, and I'm not going to really focus a lot on the station level. Here we said, but what happens if there's different impacts of oil shortage in different areas of the city? So we tested this at a station level, and we still have similar results. Can you please go to the next slide, please? And we finish by doing this analysis at an individual level. So this is not collective usage. This is one of the important analysis that we can do now that we have access to a user ID, right? So what do we get? That during the pandemic, we have around 4%, the pandemic again, the oil shortage, we have around 4% more ridership, and we have, after the oil shortage, around a decrease of 2% of ridership. If we go please to the next slide, I mean, I have a full extra minute, but still, what is the main idea? During the oil shortage, we had around 56% more ridership at a collective level. But if I analyze at an individual level, that increase was only around 4%. Now, after the oil shortage, the collective level was around 43%, while at the individual level, it decreased around 2%. So it was even lower than what they had before. So what can we learn from this? That the system mainly benefited from the newcomers to the system. Okay, so people, once everything was resolved, came back to around previous levels of usage. But the system had an important benefit because they had an inflow of a lot of new users to the system. And pretty much that's it, exactly on 10 minutes. And this is the findings of our analysis.
Great, thank you. I have one follow-up clarifying question. So to your last point, or essentially the finding that more people were taking trips on Mibitsi, but there was a similar number of trips per person. So it didn't increase the number of trips each individual took, just the total number of riders.
So at an individual level, people increased around 4% the number of rides they were taking. but at a collective level, it was 56 during the oil shortage. So we see that the system really had an important benefit by the newcomers to the system.
Okay, great, thank you. So our next presentation is, let me just pull up my notes. Our next presentation is from Viviana Fabrias, and we're getting a bit of a different perspective on bike share and micromobility in Latin America. Viviana is a civil engineer from the National University of Columbia and holds a master's degree in transportation planning from the University of Leeds in the UK. She has over 10 years of experience working on transport and mobility across Latin America and in the UK. At Steer, she leads the active transport and new mobility team in Latin America, and she's led different projects across a diverse range of areas and geographies, making her an expert in micromobility. Her passion and interest for sustainable transportation modes have enabled her to lead projects focused on promoting active and sustainable means of transport. These projects include the technical and operational design of bike share systems, the development of technology platforms to engage users, and a cycling journey planner as a component of wayfinding systems for bike users. Viviana has also worked in infrastructure, public transport, freight logistics, transportation planning, and transport institutional projects in Colombia, Mexico, Panama, and the UK. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Viviana. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Okay, so yeah, as Andy mentioned, my name is Viviana Farbiers. I work at Steer. Steer is a consultancy firm and we do mostly all related of like transport consultancy in well, in Latin America and in other cities in the world. If you can pass to the next slide, please. This is just like the information of where we operate. And as Andy mentioned, I'm leading currently the active transport and new mobility teams in Latin America. So we have been doing projects in most of the cities in this region. And what I want to talk to you today is about like the type of results that we have identified in different studies across this region regarding like some types of analysis that we have done in how people choose to use like micromobility systems or bike share systems, and where does these trips come from? I mean, which type of, which mode of transport they were using before using these systems. So Andy, if you can go to the next slide. I'm going to briefly explain like the type of methodology that we applied, and we have applied this methodology in different studies. This is just an example of those. And their results are mostly from Colombia, like different cities in Colombia. We have done this type of analysis in Bogota, Cali, Monteria, and more recently in Medellin. Hopefully some of you may be familiar with these cities, but these are like the main and biggest cities of Colombia. And we have also done like related studies in all other countries in Latin America, as I just said. Yeah, so these are just like some reflections in about the importance of like having a robust and correct planning of bike share systems. I think that all of the people like that are present here in this Congress, well, we know that, but we also know that like the benefits of micromobility and bike share systems for the cities, but we also know like the difficulties in terms of their financials, their occupation in public space, etc., if they are not planned correctly. So the methodology or the type of analysis that I'm going to explain is just like highlighting how we can do like a correct planning of bike share systems. Next slide, please. So in these studies, we have done like different type of analysis, but today I am going to focus mostly on how to understand the potential demand that these systems can have, and where, like from which modes of transport are users like that are using micromobility and bike share systems which modes of transport were they using before. And we do that based on like the first 3 bullet points that you are seeing in my slide. The first one is like how we do like the potential demand estimation and how we relate that to like the location of the operating areas or operating zones of those systems in the city that we are studying. So you can go to the next slide, please. So for the potential demand estimation, what is that? It's a methodology that we use to determine and to estimate potential trips served by the bike share systems. And this estimation is based on different characteristics, both of the users or the potential users, but also the different characteristics from the city. And from the system as well. So this includes, for example, the topography of the city, but also the availability of stations, if we are talking about a station-based system, or the availability of the bikes, and the fees of the system, and different like factors such as this. And all of this together combined in different models is what allow us to estimate how many trips and the bike share system can handle, or how many trips these systems can attract from other modes. If you can go to the next slide, please. And so in the analysis that we have done, there are some important things that are needed to consider, because the first one is that we tend to think that there are some specific trips that have like the potential to switch to micromobility or bike share systems or cycling. But we have seen using these models that some trips that are, for example, very long in distance can also be part of this potential. And we have done this through like building different models, and to also conducting different surveys that has showed us that we need to consider like a wider spectrum of trips in order to have like that, the complete potential for that. As I said, we use robust models to do this and to assess this this potential. And also in these models, it is important to analyze not only the trips that can be that can migrate, for example, for motorized modes, I don't know, a motorcycle or private vehicle, but also the trips that can switch from, for example, cycling and walking, which because is an important part of like the demand of the systems usually. Next slide, please. So how do we work to estimate the cycling potential? Well, basically, our starting point is to use the mobility data that most of the cities has. This means mobility surveys, OD surveys, and with that, we do like an identification of how are current users, cycling users today, and to determine their characteristics in terms of age, gender, the type of employment they have, like different social characteristics, and also the characteristics of current cycling trips. So it is important to understand in each specific city and like how long are the cycling trips, how feasible or like if those trips are being made, for example, in very hilly terrains or flat terrains, like considering also the characteristic of the topography and of the city itself. And also comparing this with how are the trips being done in other transport modes, such as car, bus, walking, cycling, as I said. And we combine this analysis using some mathematical models, and we obtain the cycling potential. And this is like an input for the next type of analysis that we do, which is explained in the next slide, please. And these will give us like the potential cycling trips will be like the demand part of the equation, say. And the other part of the equation is how is the infrastructure in the city and how is the topography of the city. How does these things combine together to obtain which trips can switch to the system that we are analyzing. So we used like transport models in which we quantify something that is called the impedance. I don't know how familiar you are with this terminology, but it's basically like the difficulty that a specific trip will have if I make that trip by bike. It can be an electric bike or like a normal bike, but it considers like the slope of the terrain, the distance of the trip, and also something that establishes how is the infrastructure that I have available to do that trip. So it considers also if, for example, it has I don't know, the potential to use segregated infrastructure, or if the trip, it needs to be using like the roads, sharing the space with cars, buses, etc. So we combine those things, and the results are pretty interesting because it shows us how, like, which are the zones, for example, that has like higher potential to have like cycling trips for normal bikes, or also for bike share systems. I have these maps that you are seeing in the slide are from Bogota, the capital city of Colombia, and is like an example of the types of results that we've got, that shows, for example, the zones that concentrates like higher amounts of trips in terms of the origins and destinations of those trips. And this is the way in which we can determine where, for example, is the best area for a bike share system to operate, where is the best area, or which are the zones in which a bike share system should start their operation, because there is higher potential demand in that area. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And in some of the cases, in some of the studies, we have had the availability of like a transport, like a network transport model, in which we simulate considering like the totality of the trips that are being made by the city in all of the transport modes available. And we simulate this analysis using these transport network models to see, okay, which of these trips are going to switch to the systems, and which are the more likely routes that they are going to take. So these are just, I'm not going to like explain in detail this because I don't have time, but these maps that you are seeing in the slide is like the type of example that the trips that we can analyze, and the routes that these trips can take. You can go to the next slide, please. And this is the type of results that we can obtain. And the graph in the slide shows, for example, for a study we did in Bogota, like the proportion of the trips that can migrate to cycling in general, considering bike share systems and also like private bicycle, if you want to call it like that way. So the blue lines are like the total trips being developed by car, and the red bars are the proportion of those trips that can migrate to bicycle, considering like the origin and destinations of these trips and the distance of these trips, as I just explained. And the map shows like the zones and the corridors that these trips can have in the city. And these results, for example, has been very useful for the city of Bogota in planning their cycling, the expansion of their cycling infrastructure, and the provision, ideally, of a bike share system, because the city doesn't have one at the moment. Next slide, please. And also with this type of analysis, this is an example of a study we did in which we calculated different mode shift rates for a bike share system that we were studying. And we did, to obtain this, we did a robust transport choice model based on stated preferences surveys that we did in a comprehensive set of surveys. And we identified different and interesting things about like the factors that will lead people to transfer to bike share systems. And we did like around 60 different types of scenarios. This is just a summary, but these scenarios were considering the cost, like different tariffs and cost structures to access to the bike share system, different levels of provision of cycling infrastructure that the users will have available to use the system, like in the area that it was planned to operate. And also different, it was a station-based system, so we also calculated like the walking time that the users will need to walk in order to get a bike. So this is the combination of those different factors, and the results showed that the cost was the factor, like the driving the higher, like the higher percentage of users. I mean, when we compared, for example, a scenario which a higher cost, but the same level of cycling infrastructure and the same level of or the same amount of time needed to get a bike, the cost was the factor driving like the difference between people choosing, always people choosing like the cheaper option. It was a very like interesting exercise. Another exercise that we did, which is showed in the next slide, using in this project, was whether people will be more willing to use like traditional bikes in a bike share system or electric bikes. And the results, it was a surprise for us, because we were thinking that the system should be electric, because people, like a lot of people, will prefer electric bikes. But what the results of the model and of the service showed is that this was not as important as the fact of the cost. And this was a very, very important result for the study, because the operator that hired us to do this study was thinking on buying like an important number of bikes being electric. And with these results, they switched to the option to have a portion of the fleet being traditional bikes, and that represented like an important reduction in the capital cost to implement the system in the city. And I think that that's my presentation. Well, all of these studies were done before the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So this is just a question that I leave for the audience, and I think is a question like all of the people that work in this, we are asking this all the days, like how this situation can change this type of results that I just showed and that were obtained like in normal situation. Now, maybe other factors are driving mode shift. So thanks very much. I don't know if someone has a question or.
Thanks, Viviana. We'll take questions at the end, but that was really interesting. Our next presenter is Yi Wen, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville in transportation engineering. His main research focus is understanding the various impacts brought by emerging transportation options. Prior to pursuing his doctorate, he completed a master's degree in environmental science and management at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and worked for the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition and Lime. So thanks so much, E. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to join the meeting. So I'm representing a research team of University of Tennessee, Knoxville, on a study about sustainability impacts of shared micromobility today. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So I just want to thank all the organization and individuals for supporting this study. So the study is funded by the UT, University of Tennessee Office of Sustainability. I also want to thank NAFSA and People for Bikes for funding my cost of attending the conference. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction of the shared micromobility options we have in Knoxville and UT. So we have the bike share system of 200 bikes. They are all conventional bikes. It's a hybrid model. So they have the station as well as you can drop it with a public bike rack. We also have the shared e-scooters scheme. They were introduced in the middle of the bike share program with 2 operators and totaling 500 devices, and they are powered by battery. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture showing about the options, and I think people are all very familiar with that. Next slide, please. So for our analysis, we use a 4-step approach. The first step is that we obtain trip level data from the operators, and we did some analysis and visualization, which I'm going to present momentarily. And that is going to support our analysis, because once we have the trip level data, and if we combine that with mode substitution data, meaning that what percentage of people they use electric scooters to replace a walk trip or a car driving trip, and also combine that with what is the environmental impact of per transportation mode, per mile, per person, that is going to give us a picture of how this is going to change the environment. So next slide, please. So in our first step, we analyze the trip data. As you can see, we have like a comparison here. For the bike share system, on average, it's about 0.3 per bike per day. And that was before the launch of electric scooters. After the launch, you see that that percentage dropped about 30%. In terms of trip distance, the median trip distance is at least 0.75 miles, and 3/4 of all the bike share trips are within 2 miles. But if you look at the data for the e-scooters, it's a lot popular. As you can see, it's about 9 times of the use per device per day, and the trip distance is shorter. So it's on average, the median is 0.35 miles, and almost 80% of the trips they are within 0.75 miles. So the conclusion here is that shared e-scooters, they are more popular, they are used more often, however, they travel a shorter distance. So next slide, please. So if we are going to visualize this, it's going to be interesting. So this is a map of Knoxville. We divided it into different zones based on the unique zone characteristic and the travel patterns, which you're going to understand why we did this later. So next slide, please. So this is a visualization of the trip activities. So we map out the trip origin, trip destination, and the pattern. So from the origin to the destination. And it's the same map on the same scale. But for bike share and e-scooter share, you see something different. For example, you notice that for bike share, that the trips tend to be longer. They tend to cover different zones within the Knoxville and UT area. However, when you look at e-scooter share trips, first of all, there are a lot more trips for e-scooters. However, they tend to travel shorter, and they're very compact. They are concentrated. The activities are concentrated in several zones. So that's the visualization. Next slide, please. And this is another visualization that we did. So this is using the core diagram. And each color is representing one zone that I showed earlier. I understand this chart may be a little bit hard to comprehend, but if you look at Bayesian diagram, then you'll notice that there are a lot of branches, there are a lot of interactions among different zones. But if you look at the e-scooter share, then you'll notice that a lot of the trip, they are traveling within the same zone. So that also confirms our finding that e-scooter trips are shorter and they are mainly concentrated in their own area. So next slide, please. So after knowing this, the next important data we need to rely on is mode substitution data. So if you look at bike-share, like what trips are bike-share, is bike-share replacing versus what trips are e-scooters replacing, you will see that most of them, they are really similar except for transit. So for transit, bike-share is replacing 41% of transit trips, whereas share e-scooter trips are only replacing 9% of those. And that is possibly because of transit trips are also longer, so that people need to use bike share trips which travel longer to replace them instead of a scooter trip. So if we go to the next slide. So the third step is to try to understand what is the emission profile for each mode. And we adapted this number from the newly released ITF report. And this analysis is a full life cycle analysis. So everything from manufacturing to assembly, to the user phase, to disposal, and even during the user phase for the rebalancing of these vehicles, all of those emissions, they are being considered in these figures. So for example, for transit bus, that per person per mile, that bus is going to release about 147 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then similarly, we have those numbers from different modes that share micromobilities, including bike share and e-scooters, are replacing. And we modify the number because ITF, the analysis is central to Europe. We did some modification to reflect the UT and the US situation. One thing we did was to change the fuel economic from 35 to 21 mile per gallon. And based on this data and also the mode substitution data, we are able to estimate the sustainability impacts of the both sheer micromobility options. So if we go to the next slide, please. And here is the result. One thing I want to point out is that this is the result of UT representing a 200 bike share system and a 200 bike share system and a 500 share electric scooter system. So based on the number we have for bike share, that on every year, that is going to save about 500 gallons of gasoline before the launch of e-scooters. However, after e-scooters, that number dropped to about 200 gallons. And for e-scooters, even for our best case scenario, it can save about 18,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. However, that is still a very small number compared to the overall commuting emissions. For example, in 2010, for UT, University of Tennessee, that number only represents 1% of the total commuting emissions. So it is still at its minuscule. However, there are still some lessons that we can learn from this analysis. So next slide, please. The first thing we learned is that for bike share trips, it looks like there are more utilitarian trips on bike share, whereas people use share electric scooters more for recreational purposes. And throughout our system at UT for the 200 bike, 500 electric scooter system, we noticed that e-scooters are more popular. And because of that, collectively, they are more sustainable and can replace car trips at a much larger scale than bike share. However, even we combine all the savings from bike share and scooter share, it is still a very small amount compared to the overall transportation emission. Therefore, the key to achieve sustainability through micromobility and through shared micromobility is to replace more vehicle-based trips. They are less fuel efficient. And there are many other benefits and concerns beyond mobility and environmental impacts. And we also acknowledge the limitation in this analysis. Next slide, please. So final slide here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And we really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Yi. Great presentation. Last but certainly not least, we have Stephanie Secchi. Stephanie manages a mobility partnership at Populous, a data platform for cities to manage the future of mobility. She has over 10 years of experience in policy analysis and project management in transportation and engineering. As a former senior policy analyst at Atlas Public Policy, Stephanie has advised cities from coast to coast on electric vehicle and shared mobility policy. She's previously served as a program officer at the Transportation Research Board. Stephanie has a PhD, an MS in engineering and public policy, and a BS in civil engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. And with that, I'll hand it to Stephanie.
Thank you, Andy. All right, hi everyone. As Andy said, I'm a mobility partnerships manager at Populous, and my topic is the role of shared micromobility and how people use shared e-scooter services before and after COVID. So I feel like I should start off by saying I do not have all of the answers. I have some observations that we have made early on, right after shelter in place happened, and then more recently as we've seen programs start to come on. But I think what we will see in the next few months and over the next year is the more rigorous research and analysis, much more like what my co-panelists did, that take a closer look at how usage has changed, not just for shared e-scooters, but across all modes since they're interconnected. Next slide, please. So Populous is a technology company. We have a platform that enables cities to manage data from their shared mobility programs. We also provide tools to help them to create and communicate policies around street and curb management. We host and analyze data from the world's largest mobility operators and currently delivering our services in over 70 cities across the world. And we really believe in enabling cities to access and efficiently use the data about the vehicles and other systems that are operating on their streets so that they can make informed policy decisions and make decisions on infrastructure development. Next slide. I'll do a very quick background and try to spend more time on kind of what we have observed. So this is the figure from the recent NACTA report showing the share of, well, the shared mobility ridership growth over time. We can see that there was an increase between 2018 and 2019 of shared scooter ridership. And I think we were expecting that there would be an increase in 2020 again, given that there are a lot of cities that were launching new programs. There are also some cities that were going to have the full summer month of running their scooter program for the first time. And of course, that did not happen. And I'll talk at the end that, we have some bounce back on trips, but I think a lot of it will be pushed to 2020 and we'll see what that looks like. But I think it will not look as expected, just like I did not expect to give this presentation today. Next slide, please. In addition to the work that we do with cities, we also do annual surveys in 18 major metro areas. And part of that is we ask people about their choices on trips. And specifically, we'll ask questions for people who have used e-scooters, what their trip purpose is. We also ask questions on what they would have taken if they hadn't chosen e-scooters. We have a research project with the Shared Use Mobility Center in Nelson Nygaard that's coming out through TRB hopefully soon. That's on transit and shared micromobility. And this is kind of a snippet of that, just trying to set the stage. So from our surveys, we found that the top reason that scooter users in our more dense and higher transit oriented metros were using scooters were for commute to and from work. And then in the less dense and less transit oriented metros, we were seeing that the top reason was for socializing, which is not a surprise. I think it's going to vary depending on the types of modes that you have that are available to you in your regions, but also when we're thinking about impacts and analyzing impacts from something like a pandemic or some other shock to the system, like a gas shortage, it is important, I think, to have this kind of qualitative information as well, in addition to the quantitative pieces that tell you what the trips look like. You want to know more about the choices that people were making. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We've done smaller surveys that are specific to scooter programs. So this is one that we did in Brookline, Massachusetts, where we asked very similar questions about the choices that the scooter users were making. I think more importantly, on the right side of this chart, just shows how their use of other modes changed when they started to use e-scooter trips. So we see less trips in Ubers and Lyfts, less driving, but also less transit and bike use as well. Okay, next slide. So I think we all know this. When the stay-at-home orders hit, everything changed pretty quickly. A shift in how people were moving around the city and also how goods were moving around the city. So less use of transit and shared service ridership, reduced overall personal travel, but also an increase in other services like on-demand delivery of both groceries and food from restaurants, or ordering online just for the things that you need at home. I'll be focusing on e-scooters, but this is a broader system. And I think to understand the impacts, we do have to consider the interconnectedness of them. I just have more information on the e-scooter part of it. So that's what I will share. So I'm gonna pause here because before I jump into what we have observed, I posed a poll question. If you look in the poll, it should be the second question. If you haven't already voted, it's if you used shared micromobility services before the pandemic, how has your use changed since then? Since the start of the pandemic, I should say. So you can click on the vote there. I'm just curious to see within this group how people's use has changed. So I'll give it a second to come in. It looks like less frequent use is winning. With almost 50%, which I think makes sense based on what we've seen in terms of trips. Yeah, looks like that's the winners. Some had more frequent use, some had no change, and a few did not use the services previously. Also, they're not available everywhere, so that makes sense as well. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into what we saw in some cities. Next slide, please. I'm going to use Baltimore as a first example. So Baltimore has a very popular shared e-scooter program. They also have very specific equity requirements in that each operator has to deploy a minimum number of vehicles in each of their equity zones, which is shown in the figure on the right. And then they're able to track usage from those equity zones over time. And that's important to them as they evaluate their program. So if you go to the next slide, they shared some early results from right after shelter in place. So this is a chart showing trips over time. They start in February. You can see there's a dip, and where the arrow is pointing to, that's when the shelter in place order hit. There's a dip in the total trips. If you look at the line above in blue, this is showing the percentage of trips coming from their equity zones. And at the point of shelter in place, they actually saw an uptick in trips as a percentage of the total trips. So that could mean that they had the same number of trips, but the total trips decreased, or could be that they were a little less, or it could mean that they're saying more. It's kind of, they need to do a deeper dive to kind of dig deeper into what caused that, but it was observed. And I think it confirms for the city that they're going to see different impacts in different parts of the city. And the fact that they are tracking within their equity zones gives them this extra information as they maybe decide to change their program or adjust their equity zones or think about how they are responding to hopefully once in a lifetime pandemics, but any other shocks that might come where people have to change the way that they're moving around the city. I think I haven't gotten an update from the city. I did kind of peek at the data a little bit, and it looked like this trend continued through April and then kind of leveled off back to where it was, which I'm assuming is also when trips started to pick up again. Next slide, please. Oh, this is very hard to see. Sorry about that. So this is San Francisco, looking at scooter trips by location right before the shelter in place and then right after. I'll just highlight on the left side, there's a lot of dark blue, which means more trips up near the wharfs. On the Embarcadero, this is where there's a lot of tourist activity and a lot of social activity. And this was right before shelter in place in San Francisco. It is very hard to see, but I can tell you that if you look on the right side in that image, a lot of those trips that were happening along the water in the Embarcadero are now shifted to the area kind of south of there, which is a much more residential neighborhood. And then I'll have the next slide, please. So another change that happened over this time is that cities were looking at allocating their space differently. And many cities implemented what were called slow streets or active streets or quiet streets. I've seen a lot of different names, but they all had the same idea, which is to give people more space to move around in the city without cars on them. So it's basically closing off streets through car traffic and opening up more space for people on foot and on bike and on scooter. I think we are still waiting to see how prolonged this is, what it happens after pandemic, whether there are more permanent changes. But I think I know cities will be interested in understanding what the usage of these streets were and how maybe people changed their behavior because they were available. And in San Francisco, I know they initially opened them up because they were trying to connect parts of the city where the bus system had stopped operating. So that's also pretty specific and interesting use case to analyze. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we actually did a quick analysis recently. There's a blog post that Spin posted. So we did it with Spin in San Francisco. And they wanted to see what the usage of their shared scooters was like pre and post pandemic along two of the slow streets in San Francisco. So the squiggly line on the left is JFK Drive, which is in Golden Gate Park. And the straight line on the right, that's Page Street. It's that's a long slow street through kind of one of the main parts of the city. And then we're looking at a GIF that's shifting between March of 2020 and August of 2020, and looking at the number of trips in these areas. So the darker areas are where you're seeing more trips. And what we're seeing that there is a shift. There's definitely more usage on the slow streets than there were before, but also there's a general shift in usage towards the park and beyond, I'm guessing, which is where the ocean is. And there's another slow street along the ocean as well. So generally seeing a shift in where people are using scooters. That still doesn't answer the question of what are they doing or why are they taking the trips, but it is interesting to see that visually. And I think that's important information for cities to have and to consider as they're thinking about longer term planning changes. And I'll take the last slide, please, or the next slide. Okay, so I was just gonna do like a quick, what are we saying now? I think I have been asked quite a bit, are shared e-scooters bouncing back? And I think the answer is yes. It's yes. I think we have seen from the operator and a lot of operators starting to return. And that has been in the last couple of months, so towards the end of the summer. And operators themselves are reporting longer trip distances and durations that they've seen. I think maybe that is a change in how people are using them. Maybe it is that the pool of users is just different than it was before. I think there's more digging to do there to kind of disentangle some of those factors. But that I think is an interesting point to consider. And we've also seen some consolidation in the operator space. So we've seen some operators merge, others disappear, and others pop up. And so I think that will continue to happen. We were seeing that before the pandemic. So I think it may have accelerated some things that were going to happen anyway. And then in city programs, a lot of programs that were paused are restarting or have already restarted in the last couple of months. Some do have fewer operators than they did before. Delayed programs are launching. I think many cities thought that they would have the whole summer to test out their programs, and now they're looking at smaller windows of time with winter arriving soon in a lot of locations. And then some city programs are just pushed to 2020. So I think there'll be hopefully more happening in 2021. We shall see. But I think I just want to reiterate that what I'm sharing are really observations, but what will be really interesting to see are the analyses that come out, the research work that takes a deeper dive in both thinking about the quantitative data on trips, but also the qualitative data on the choices that people are making and how they've changed pre and post pandemic. And even beyond, I think it'll be interesting to see how lasting maybe some of those changes are. You can go to my last slide, it's just contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So now we're entering the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. To get the conversation going, I did have one question for the panelists, and I also posed this question in one of the poll questions. So if you haven't already, please type in your answer or take a look at what other people are saying. But I'm curious to hear from the panelists. Micromobility services today, even in markets where they are successful, are just capturing a tiny share of total trips. So what's something you feel would have to happen to get micromobility to reach its full potential in terms of mode share?
I can start. I think what we have observed is that the cost, comparable cost between micromobility and other options, it matters. And I think that was a finding in someone in maybe Viviana's work as well. But I think that's true. If cities want to encourage more use of these shared micromobility options, and that's important to meet some city climate goals or broader goals, I think pricing it in a way where it is attractive as opposed to some of the other options, I think could make a big difference.
I have an answer, and obviously it's not an attractive one, but oil shortage, right? So pretty much with the idea, obviously it's kind of a joke, but the forced adoption of the service, I mean, what we found with our analysis is that once people tried it, they stayed with it, right? Not because once the problem is fixed, then you go back to your regular routine, right? Once you had the problem, you went longer distances, you used it for more time. However, that forced adoption, it really brought a lot of newcomers to the system. And once they tried it, they stayed with it, right? So this tells a lot about what could happen in terms of public policy of service adoption, or just generally speaking, marketing, pricing strategies, right? So what we want people is to try the product, try the service. Our experience is once they try it, they stay with it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to complement something that Stephanie was saying, and it's about the cost. Yeah, indeed. I think in the studies that I have shown, and I think in the other presentation that it's clear, but also something that is very relevant and related to the cost in the Latin American context, I think, and is that most of the bike share systems or the micromobility systems that are currently operating in nice areas of the cities. But our LATAM cities have another reality in which a lot of people live, a lot of people depending mostly, for example, in public transportation. And given that the cost is the fact that will drive a lot how many people use these systems, I will also think that cost and coverage, because these systems are located mostly in nice areas of the city, serving a very, very small portion of the population. So I would like to comment on that.
And I will just finally add one thing. I think infrastructure plays a key role. We see that more people feel comfortable using a scooter compared to a bike share, and we all feel extremely more comfortable driving a car versus biking. And part of that is because of the infrastructure. Like the infrastructure for car is just way more better, way more safer. So if we want to push micromobility, infrastructure is something that we have to look at and improve.
Great, thank you. Yeah, looking at the poll results from the audience, I think a lot of the sentiments that you guys described is kind of being echoed here. So the top poll result was 7 votes for existing infrastructure. Other items that got multiple votes were location. New users need more tools and incentives to try, and they're more susceptible to service level failure. So I guess that idea of barrier to entry and someone's first experience with bike share. Equipment limitations, car culture, it's too easy to drive, pricing, and space dedicated to cars, the footprint of the system, and just like public transit, fear in trying it, and this idea of like trying to get people to surpass that barrier of initially using the system. I see a bunch of questions are coming in. Let me see, we have a few in Zoom and a few in Pathfinder. So the first one here is from Allison Miller, and it looks like it's for all panelists, and she's asking if the split, if there was a split between men and women for new users. So maybe that's more relevant to Alberto, to your study in particular, or maybe to also what you looked at, Stephanie, if you saw any gender split in users.
So I would need to go quickly through the data, but I remember that for 2019, around 32% of the users were women, and they accounted for around 1/4 of the trip. So let's say 25%. So that's what I recall from that first semester of the year.
Okay. We have a question for Yi from Holly Parker. The question is, how did the heat map of scooter and bike share trips relate to the geofence zones for those systems?
Thank you. I think that's a brilliant question, and I didn't show the zones. But for the bike share, there is no geofence zone in our city. For the scooters, they are mostly confined in the downtown and UT area, and that partly explains why they are mostly concentrated in the downtown and UT area. And I think this is chicken and egg questions, because in our city, the city government, they don't want they want people to use scooters safely, so that they are kind of concerned about expanding the area for scooters to serve more area, to serve more people. And because of that, anecdotally, we hear from student users that they feel like the scooters are not really helping them to replace some trips, for example, car trips. So we also try to push, of course, when it's safe, we also try to push that cities can be more flexible in terms of the area that scooters can operate. And our argument is that with that, maybe more people will use scooters and start replacing vehicle trips. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you. We have a question from Steve Hoyt-Macbeth for Stephanie. He's asking if e-scooter trips have returned to 2019 trip levels.
I think they're building up to them. I don't know. I haven't looked at all the data, so I don't have an exact answer, but I don't think they're quite there, but we have seen them building up in the past couple of months since the scooters have come back. But it does definitely vary by region and by city.
Yeah. I have a question, a follow-up question on that is, and you might not know the answer. For the systems that shut down during the lockdown versus the ones that stayed open, have you seen any difference in the recovery of trips?
That is a very good question that I do not know the answer to, but I think somebody should do an analysis on. Because I kind of feel like it might be kind of related to what Alberto was looking at. Like if you had a system that stayed and there were new users, then maybe those new users are now dedicated to that operator as opposed to other ones that had left and came back. I don't know. It seems possible, but I think in general, overall, there was the same kind of dip in usage, and that we're seeing the same kind of build back up. But I'm sure you could I bet there are differences. I just don't know what they are. Yeah. Somebody will do that analysis.
And for any of the attendees, if you have any insights in that, please feel free to drop that in the chat, and I'll echo those. Okay, we have a question for Yi from Aaron Raquel. Are you hopeful that bike and scooter share can make a meaningful impact in the way we navigate cities and reduce emissions? The findings you presented make it seem like we have a long way to go before we see any significant impact, if we ever do.
Yes and no. I'm hopeful that scooters and other micromobility systems, they will play a bigger role in the future to come, especially especially after COVID. I think we will start to see that some trips, they are like some transportation trips, they are not that necessary. And I think people have learned the lesson and try to make our transportation system more efficient. And at the same time, we also see that the transportation system in general is getting cleaner. So if the vehicles that used to transport the system gets cleaner and the system itself is getting improved, then the role of micromobility will becoming marginal, just because the savings per mile per person is getting smaller. But if we are ever reaching at that point, I think the question will be, maybe sheer micromobility is not the best solution to make our Earth a better place. Then what is that solution? I think we will still have a long way to go before that conversation, reappears.
And I feel like it's also hard to quantify the kind of aggregate benefit of when you have something like micromobility, it makes it easier to live without a car. So you have this knock-on effect of people using public transit potentially more, relying on automobiles less, lower car ownership. So it's kind of that indirect benefit. Okay, we're almost out of time, but we do have a few more questions. So Noah had a question for Alberto and for Viviana. I'll start with the question to Alberto. What do you conclude from a practical perspective? What kind of strategies or actions could the operator or managers of micromobility systems apply to encourage more usage, except for fuel shortages?
So the idea is, if you're a government, then you try to force adoption, right? So like what Stephanie mentioned earlier, like if you have these quiet streets, if you just start limiting the use of cars, then people will need to move and will move. But from a practical perspective, if you're an operator, then that's not in your realm of what you can do. But what you can do is, how can you invite adoption? Think about like this free initial usage. Think about like HBO gives you 7 days, Netflix gives you a month or whatever. So what we have learned is that once they try the service, they try to stick to it and they enjoy using it, right? So how can we make people use this for the first time? So the main benefit could be to try to approach those that are not users today. If they try it, our research says they stay with it.
And then to Viviana, what level of precision do you find in your approximations? What have you done to verify your results? And in your experience, what data do you consider to be the most relevant?
Okay, thanks. Well, regarding the first question about like the precision and like checking the results, those studies that I showed are from the last year and are for cities that are planning to implement their bike share system. So they have not implemented the bike share system yet. They are using these studies in order to like do all the procurement and all the things that they need to do. So we have not been able to check the precision, but the methodology that we are using is based on like how you say that, like the theoretical portion of how you plan transport systems. We at STEER do a lot of like transport models in order to quantify demand for transit operations and demand for transport in general. So we are using the same kind of techniques, but with some specific service targeted to micromobility users. But we have not been able to check the results because those systems have not been implemented yet. In terms of the data that I consider the most relevant, well, I think it's a combination of different things, but certainly having, for example, mobility data from the city, like if you are planning a bike share system, you need to know how the city moves without the systems. I mean, in current situations, you need to know where people live, where people want to go, how are the times of the trips, at what time are they done. those are like the basic data that you will need in order to plan a system, to have a picture of how is the mobility pattern of the city. That I will say that is the most relevant one. That combined with specific surveys that you need to do in order to understand the potential that the people living in that city will have to use a bike share system. I hope that answered your question, Noe.
Thank you. It looks like we are out of time. That being said, if you go into Pathable and you have any other questions for the panelists, you can directly message them through the system. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm told it's very easy to figure out. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the great questions and the feedback and comments that we received. And I hope you learned something. I certainly did. And I will see or talk to you guys all another time. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.